We are continuing on our journey through the 39 Melachot, or prohibited activities on Shabbat. Through these mitzvot, we declare that Hashem is the creator of the world, and we cease from these activities on Shabbat, just as he ceased from his creative work on the seventh day. These next two prohibited categories of work were required for making fabric. The fabric was used to make draperies and the garments for the Kohanim in the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. In order to make the fabric appear seamless, it required the skillful tying of knots by twisting threads from two sections of fabric together, ensuring that the threads were securely intertwined. Of course, during this process, it was sometimes necessary to untie knots. Since Shabbat is the day in which we cease from the activities involved with building the Mishkan, tying and untying many types of knots is prohibited on Shabbat. So what are some practical applications of these prohibitions today? A good rule of thumb is any knot that is intended to remain indefinitely or for more than 24 hours is prohibited from tying on Shabbat. There are often knots in the string or cord of a hood or the waist of a skirt, and that knot is intended to hold the string in. So if that knot becomes untied, retying it on Shabbat to prevent the string from falling out would be prohibited, since that's going to be a permanent knot. Likewise, if the cord completely pulls out of the garment or the hood, it would be prohibited to thread it back in, because one would need to tie that permanent knot in order to hold the thread or cord in. Also, a jump rope. Many times a long length of cord needs to have a couple of knots on it for handles or in order to secure the handle. Since those would be a permanent knot and not something that you intend to untie shortly, it would be prohibited to tie those knots. And even though women are not usually involved in tying knots for tzitzit, these knots are also intended to be permanent knots. So it would be prohibited on Shabbat to retie those knots or to tighten those knots. Also, some blouses are adorned with ribbons that are tied in a tight bow and are really intended to remain that way as part of the decoration. So it would be prohibited on Shabbat to tie or retie one of those types of bows, though if it is a sash or something that's supposed to keep the garment closed that you would have to untie to remove the garment, that would be permitted since it's clearly a temporary knot. It's also permitted for a man to tie a necktie on Shabbat, since that's going to be undone at the end of the day when he removes the tie. Things that are not problematic to tie be shoelaces, since those are going to be undone to remove the shoes. And as I mentioned, any sashes for skirts, blouses. If you have a coat, a trench coat, you need to secure it to you by putting a knot in it. Even a double knot would be acceptable in that case, because in order to remove the coat, you're going to be removing that knot, so you never intended it to be permanent. Similarly, it's permitted to tie the strings of an apron or a baby's bib, since those would be removed at some time, probably during Shabbat. As far as untying goes, the principle is any knot that is prohibited from tying on Shabbat would also be prohibited to untie. So if a knot is intended to be in place for less than 7 days, it may be untied on Shabbat. In some case, this is limited to 3 days or less, so this is a good opportunity for you to have a conversation with your rabbi to find out what your particular tradition is. A knot that is intended to remain for more than 7 days or is ordinarily left for an indefinite period may not be untied on Shabbat. A knot that was in place for more than 7 days but would cause a hardship if it's not undone could be undone on Shabbat. An example of that would be if the sash of a coat was left tied either when it was removed or hung up, and you needed to use this coat for Shabbat, it would be permissible to untie the knot so that you could remove it. Also, if you have a pile of freshly cleaned laundry that's been professionally done and has strings tied around it, if you needed to get to one of those garments, it would be permissible If you needed to get to one of those garments, it would be permitted for you to untie that knot. It would also be permissible to tie a trash bag with just a single knot or with a slip knot, since that's not going to be a secure knot that would be intended to be permanent. And often we do tend to go back into the trash bags to add some more things, so it would be permitted to untie those as well. But you want to make sure that you use caution not to do the double knot in it, because once it's tied securely and tight, it would be prohibited to untie it, and that would be a prohibited knot to tie on Shabbat. So that concludes our journey through tying and untying knots on Shabbat. Think about how you might be able to add this to your Shabbat observance and more fully connect with Hashem. So continue on your journey through Shabbat learning and continue with Torch.